At 11:23 a.m. on August 13, 1945, 8 Browning M2 machine guns erupted simultaneously. 50 caliber rounds tore through the engine cowling of a Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighter at 800 yards. The Japanese aircraft shuddered violently as metal fragments exploded from its fuselage. Black smoke belched from the engine. Flames erupted from the fuel tanks. The fighter spiraled downward, trailing fire across the Korean sky like a dying comet. Inside the cockpit of a P-47 Thunderbolt, First Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo watched his first kill fall 8,000 feet to the earth below. He did not celebrate. He did not pause. His finger remained on the trigger as he shifted his gun sight to the second enemy aircraft. 26 years old, 9 combat missions, 0 kills until this moment. The next 4 minutes would change everything. The son of a Mexican immigrant who had ridden with Pancho Villa during the Revolution was about to become the last pilot in United States history to shoot down 5 aircraft in a single day. Nobody in the sky over Korea that morning knew the war was already over. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima 6 days earlier, on Nagasaki 4 days ago. Emperor Hirohito was meeting with his war council at that exact moment, debating surrender while his pilots still flew, and American pilots still hunted. 50-plus Japanese aircraft had risen to meet 38 American Thunderbolts in what would later become Seoul. The Americans were outnumbered. They were 750 miles from home base on Ieshima, a tiny island northwest of Okinawa. And Oscar Perdomo was diving toward 3 trailing enemy fighters with 3,000 rounds of ammunition loaded and ready. Painted on the nose of his aircraft was a name that would prove prophetic in the next 6 minutes. Lil May's meat chopper showed a baby in a diaper chomping a cigar, wearing a derby hat, clutching a rifle. It was a tribute to his infant son Kenneth, waiting back home in Los Angeles. Perdomo had no way of knowing whether he would see that boy again. The mission profile demanded 8 hours of flying time, 1,500 miles round trip. Most of it over open ocean, where a single engine failure meant certain death by drowning. But the P-47 Thunderbolt was built for exactly this kind of insane mission. Republic Aviation had redesigned their legendary fighter specifically for the Pacific Theater, adding wet wings that carried 93 gallons of fuel in each wing route. The aircraft could haul over 1,200 gallons when fully loaded with external tanks, giving it the range to escort B-29 superfortresses all the way to Japan and back. It packed the firepower to destroy anything it caught, with 8 machine guns firing 3,000 rounds total, powered by a 2,800 horsepower Pratt & Whitney radial engine that could push the 7-ton fighter past 460 miles per hour in level flight. But for 6 weeks, all that range and firepower had been wasted. The 57th Fighter Group had flown mission after mission from Ieshima, with almost nothing to show for it. They had escorted bombers that dropped their payloads on empty airfields. They had strafed targets that rarely shot back. They had burned fuel and expended ammunition on a ghost war because the Japanese were hoarding their aircraft, saving every fighter and every experienced pilot for the invasion everyone expected. American military planners had grimly calculated that Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, would cost 1 million Allied casualties and potentially 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths. Every B-29 that burned Tokyo brought that apocalyptic invasion one day closer. Every fighter sweep that found empty skies reinforced the terrible knowledge that Japan was preparing for a final battle that would make D-Day look like a practice exercise. Pilots in the 57th joked darkly that the enemy had simply run out of planes. August 13th, 1945, proved them catastrophically wrong. Mission 507-35 had launched 53 Thunderbolts at dawn. 15 had turned back with mechanical problems or navigation errors, a normal attrition rate for missions that pushed aircraft to their absolute operational limits. The remaining 38 had droned northwest across the East China Sea for hours, maintaining strict radio silence, watching the fuel gauges tick down with every mile that separated them from safety. They crossed the Korean coastline and were approaching Kimpo Airfield, near what would later become Seoul, when radar operators back on Ie-shima transmitted an urgent warning. Contacts. Lots of contacts. The Japanese 22nd and 85th Sentais had scrambled everything they possessed. Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighters, Japan's best interceptor in August 1945. Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters, older but still deadly in the hands of experienced pilots. Even a pair of Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainers had somehow found themselves in the wrong piece of sky at the worst possible moment. For the first time in 6 weeks, the 57th Fighter Group had found the aerial opposition they had been searching for. Or, more accurately, the aerial opposition had found them. Oscar Perdomo had grown up in East Los Angeles, the son of immigrants who had crossed the border seeking a better life than revolutionary Mexico could offer. His father had stories about riding with Pancho Villa, though Oscar never knew how much was truth and how much was the mythology that all immigrants carry with them. Before the war, Oscar had worked at the Pacific Milk Crate Company, a job that paid the bills but promised no future beyond assembly line monotony. Pearl Harbor had changed everything for millions of young American men. Oscar had volunteered for pilot training, passed the physical and mental tests that eliminated 70% of applicants, and survived the brutal year-long program that turned civilians into fighter pilots. He had earned his wings. He had been assigned to the 57th Fighter Group. He had flown 9 combat missions without firing his guns at a single enemy aircraft. 0 kills over 9 missions was not unusual in the summer of 1945. The air war over the Pacific had become so one-sided that many American fighter pilots never encountered Japanese aircraft at all. But it gnawed at Perdomo nevertheless. He had trained for years to become a fighter pilot. He had learned gunnery, tactics, navigation, all the skills that kept men alive in combat. And for 6 weeks, he had done nothing but fly enormous circles in the sky, while bombers did the real work of ending the war. That was about to change in the most violent and concentrated 4 minutes of his entire life. At 800 yards, Oscar Perdomo centered his gun sight on the nearest enemy Ki-84 and pressed the trigger. The P-47N shuddered as 8 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. Tracers reached across the sky in brilliant streams of light. The Japanese fighter took hits across its engine cowling and cockpit. The pilot never had time to react. The aircraft simply came apart in mid-air, pieces separating from the fuselage as flames consumed what remained. First kill. Perdomo was already shifting his aim to the second aircraft before the first had finished its death spiral. Standard tactics from training had been drilled into every American fighter pilot until they could execute them in their sleep. Hit the rear aircraft first, so the leaders don't know they're under attack until their wingmen start burning. The element of surprise was everything in aerial combat. The second Ki-84 tried to break right when its pilot finally realized they were under attack. Too slow. The P-47N weighed nearly 20,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel and ammunition. It could not turn with a Japanese fighter in a sustained horizontal dogfight. It could not climb as fast as the lighter enemy aircraft. But it could dive like nothing else in the sky, and when a Thunderbolt pilot caught an enemy from above and behind with a significant speed advantage, the mathematics of aerial combat became brutally simple. Speed plus firepower plus surprise equals destruction. The second Ki-84 took concentrated fire across its entire fuselage. Perdomo saw pieces of wings separate, saw part of the tail assembly tear free, saw flames erupt from ruptured fuel tanks. The fighter became a tumbling fireball, falling toward the Korean countryside 8,000 feet below. 2 kills in less than 60 seconds. The third Japanese pilot had seen enough death. He rolled inverted and dove for the deck, accelerating away from the American who had just killed 2 of his squadron mates, in the time it takes to breathe twice. Perdomo let him go. Chasing a single fleeing enemy meant losing sight of the larger battle developing around him. And somewhere in the chaos above Korea, 37 other American pilots were fighting more than 50 Japanese aircraft in the largest aerial engagement the 57th Fighter Group would ever see. But Oscar Perdomo's morning was far from over. He was about to discover something about himself that no amount of training could have revealed. He was very good at this. 2 Japanese fighters destroyed in 60 seconds. Oscar Perdomo pulled the P-47N into a climbing turn, scanning the chaotic sky above Korea for more targets. 24 rounds per gun per second. 8 guns firing simultaneously. He had just expended nearly 400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition to achieve 2 kills. His ammunition counters showed 2,600 rounds remaining. Enough firepower to destroy a dozen more aircraft if he could find them. But finding targets in the swirling chaos of 50-plus Japanese fighters mixing with 38 American Thunderbolts was proving more difficult than the actual killing. Smoke trails crisscrossed the sky at every altitude. Parachutes drifted toward the Korean countryside below. Aircraft twisted and dove in every direction, friend and enemy so intermixed that positive identification became the difference between victory and fratricide. And somewhere in that deadly confusion, Oscar Perdomo was about to discover that his morning had barely begun. The problem with becoming an ace in a single day was simple mathematics. 5 confirmed kills required 5 separate engagements. 5 opportunities where speed and altitude and ammunition all aligned perfectly. 5 moments where the enemy cooperated by flying into your gun sight long enough to take lethal damage. Most fighter pilots flew entire combat tours without finding those 5 perfect moments. Oscar Perdomo would find 3 more in the next 4 minutes, and the 5th would nearly kill him. He spotted movement at 10,000 feet. 2 aircraft flying in tight formation, heading northeast away from the main battle. Wrong silhouettes for Thunderbolts. Wrong flight profile for combat aircraft. He blinked twice, uncertain what his eyes were showing him. The shapes belonged to training aircraft, not fighters. Yokosuka K-5Y Willow biplanes, canvas-covered relics that had no business being anywhere near an aerial battle between modern fighters. Maximum speed, 132 miles per hour. No armor. No self-sealing fuel tanks. 1 defensive machine gun operated by a student gunner who had probably never fired at a real target. What they were doing over Korea on August 13, 1945, made absolutely no tactical sense. Perhaps they had been ferrying between airfields when the battle erupted. Perhaps their instructors had made a catastrophic navigation error. Perhaps the Japanese were so desperate for aircraft that they were throwing trainers into combat alongside their best fighters. It did not matter. They wore Japanese markings. They were legitimate military targets. And Oscar Perdomo was diving toward them at 400 miles per hour, with his finger moving toward the trigger. The Willow pilots saw him coming. Both biplanes broke formation instantly, each choosing a different escape route. One turned hard left toward a cloud bank. The other dove for the deck, trading altitude for speed in the desperate hope that terrain masking might provide cover. Perdomo selected the closer aircraft and opened fire. The engagement lasted exactly 3 seconds. A biplane trainer doing 130 miles per hour cannot evade a diving P-47N doing 400. The mathematics were absolute. Tracers converged on the Willow's fabric-covered fuselage. The aircraft caught fire immediately. No armor plating to stop the .50 caliber rounds. No self-sealing tanks to prevent ignition. The biplane spiraled right, trailing black smoke, and impacted the ground in a column of flame that marked Perdomo's third kill of the morning. He searched for the second Willow, but the pilot had escaped into the cloud bank or disappeared against the terrain below. No matter. 3 confirmed kills before noon. Oscar Perdomo was no longer a fighter pilot with 0 victories. He was becoming something else entirely. He pulled the Thunderbolt up through 8,000 feet, regaining altitude while checking his ammunition counters. The Willow had required only a 2-second burst, perhaps 150 rounds total across all 8 guns. He still had more than 2,400 rounds remaining, plenty of ammunition for the long flight home, plenty of firepower if he encountered more enemy aircraft. What he found instead were 4 Japanese fighters waiting in ambush. They held the altitude advantage at 12,000 feet, positioned perfectly with the sun behind them. 4 Nakajima Ki-84 Frank fighters, Japan's best interceptor, flown by pilots who understood tactics and timing. They had watched the American Thunderbolt climb through the clouds below. They had seen him execute the classic bounce on the training aircraft. And now they were diving toward him in a textbook attack that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots throughout the Pacific War. Oscar Perdomo saw them at the last possible moment. 4 shapes materializing out of the sun glare, growing larger with terrifying speed. He had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether his infant son Kenneth would grow up with a father or with a folded flag and a medal. Most pilots would have dove for the deck. Running from a diving attack meant taking hits, but at least you kept the enemy behind you, where your armor plate and engine block provided some protection. The P-47N could absorb tremendous punishment from its radial engine and armored cockpit, but not from 4 aircraft firing simultaneously. Not from 64 machine guns and 4 20mm cannons all converging on a single target. Perdomo did something that violated every instinct a pilot possessed. He turned into the attack. The maneuver caught the Japanese formation completely off guard. They had calculated intercept angles based on an enemy who would either dive or attempt to turn away. Instead, the Thunderbolt was climbing toward them, nose high, closing the distance at a combined speed of nearly 900 miles per hour. For exactly 1 second, all 4 Ki-84 pilots had to readjust their aim. That 1 second was enough. Perdomo rolled the P-47N inverted and pulled through, reversing direction while the Japanese fighters overshot below him. Their diving speed carried them past and underneath, exactly as he had planned. The geometry had changed. The hunters had become targets. He selected the trailing Ki-84 and pressed the trigger. The Japanese pilot never saw the burst coming. 50 caliber rounds tore through the engine cowling and cockpit. The fighter exploded in a ball of orange flame, pieces separating from the fuselage as it tumbled toward Earth. 4 kills. Oscar Perdomo had just become an ace. Not over months of combat flying dozens of sorties. Not through patient hunting across enemy skies. In one engagement lasting less than 5 minutes, he had achieved what most fighter pilots never accomplished in their entire careers. The designation would not become official until intelligence officers reviewed his gun camera footage. But the film would not lie. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed. 4 distinct engagements. 4 separate kills that met every requirement for confirmed victories. The remaining 3 Ki-84 fighters scattered. One dove for the deck at maximum speed. Another climbed toward the cloud layer. The third attempted to circle back for another pass, but Perdomo ignored them all. His ammunition counters showed 2,100 rounds remaining. Perhaps 90 seconds of continuous fire. But ammunition management was critical on missions that required 8 hours of flight time. He needed to conserve rounds for the long journey home in case he encountered more enemy aircraft over the East China Sea. He also needed to find his squadron. The sky over Kimpo had transformed into complete chaos. At least a dozen smoke columns rose from crash sites on the ground. Aircraft circled at every altitude, some still fighting, others simply trying to survive long enough to disengage. Perdomo spotted a pair of P-47Ns at 5,000 feet, their distinctive paddle blade propellers catching the morning sun. Friendlies. He banked toward them. Then he saw what they were fighting. A single Ki-84 had latched onto the tail of one Thunderbolt and refused to let go. The American pilot was jinking hard, throwing his aircraft into violent, evasive maneuvers. But the Japanese fighter matched every move with a superior turning performance that made the Frank one of the most dangerous interceptors in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. The second P-47N was attempting to help, but the geometry was impossible. Every time the wingman lined up a shot, his squadron mate flew directly into his line of fire. Perdomo pushed the throttle to maximum power and dove toward the engagement. His ammunition counters showed 2,100 rounds remaining. The meat chopper had perhaps 30 seconds of firing time left, if he held the trigger down continuously. It would have to be enough for one more kill. He came in from above and behind, using the same attack profile that had worked 4 times already that morning. The Ki-84 pilot was focused entirely on the Thunderbolt filling his gun sight, waiting for the perfect moment to fire the killing burst. He never checked his 6 o'clock position. He never saw Oscar Perdomo diving toward him at 450 miles per hour with 8 machine guns aligned on his fuselage. Perdomo centered his gun sight and pressed the trigger. He held it down. Tracers reached across 600 yards of sky, converging on the Japanese fighter. Hits sparkled along the fuselage and wings. The Ki-84 shuddered violently. Smoke began pouring from the engine cowling. And then the guns went silent. Not a gradual slowdown, not a few final rounds stuttering out. Complete and total silence. All 8 Browning M2 machine guns had run dry simultaneously. 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition had been completely expended in less than 6 minutes of combat. The Ki-84 was damaged but still flying. Smoke trailed from its engine, but the aircraft remained under control, still maneuverable, still deadly. The Japanese pilot suddenly realized he was under attack from a new direction. He broke off his pursuit of the wounded Thunderbolt and turned toward Perdomo. Oscar Perdomo was now 750 miles from home base, alone in hostile airspace, with a damaged enemy fighter turning to kill him, and exactly 0 rounds of ammunition remaining. And this is where everything became truly insane. 0 ammunition, damaged enemy fighter turning toward him, 750 miles from home base over hostile territory. Oscar Perdomo had just expended 3,000 rounds in 6 minutes to become an ace. Now he faced a choice that defined the difference between pilots who survived wars and pilots who became statistics. Run or fight. Mathematics demanded retreat. An unarmed P-47N against an armed Ki-84 represented a calculation with only one rational answer. Dive for maximum speed. Use the Thunderbolt's superior power-to-weight ratio. Put distance between yourself and the threat. Return to Shima. Live to fly another mission. But Oscar Perdomo did not run. The Ki-84 completed its turn and pointed its nose directly at the American Thunderbolt. The Japanese pilot could see the distinctive checkered cowling of the 57th Fighter Group. He could not know that the 8 gun ports staring back at him were completely empty. From his perspective, this was simply another American fighter that needed to be destroyed before he could escape the battle zone and nurse his damaged aircraft home. This is where the legend of the meat chopper truly began. Perdomo turned into the attack. The maneuver violated every principle of aerial combat survival. An unarmed aircraft charging an armed enemy made no tactical sense whatsoever. But Perdomo understood something the mathematics could not capture. The Japanese pilot did not know his guns were empty. All the enemy could see was an American fighter coming straight at him, nose to nose, at a combined closing speed approaching 800 miles per hour. Aerial chicken, the deadliest game in the Pacific sky. The Ki-84 pilot flinched first. With smoke still trailing from his damaged engine and an apparently armed Thunderbolt boring in at full power, he broke right and abandoned his attack run. Perdomo followed, turning inside the Japanese fighter, maintaining the aggressive posture, keeping his empty gun ports pointed at the enemy. Every second he kept the Ki-84 defensive was another second his squadron mates could use to reach the fight. He keyed his radio and called for help. The transmission crackled across the tactical frequency. American in trouble, engaged with enemy, need immediate assistance. Somewhere in the chaos over Korea, another P-47N pilot heard the call and responded. Perdomo continued his deadly dance with a damaged Ki-84. Turn, counter-turn, dive, climb. The Thunderbolt's empty guns pointed at the Japanese fighter again and again, each time forcing the enemy pilot to react defensively, to break away, to maneuver instead of attack. The deception could not last forever. Eventually, the Japanese pilot would realize no tracers were coming from those 8 gun ports. Eventually, he would understand his opponent was bluffing with an empty hand. The help arrived before that moment came. A second P-47N dropped out of the clouds at maximum power. The pilot had seen the engagement geometry and positioned himself for a clean, killing shot. The Ki-84, focused entirely on the Thunderbolt that had been harassing him for 90 seconds, never saw the new threat approaching from above. 8 50-caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The Japanese fighter disintegrated under concentrated fire. Wings separated from fuselage. The engine tore free and tumbled earthward. What remained scattered across the Korean sky in burning fragments. 5 kills. Oscar Perdomo had just achieved something fewer than 100 American pilots accomplished during the entire war. He had become an ace in a single day. The last pilot in United States history to earn that distinction. But his war was not over yet. Intelligence reports from August 13th painted a picture that shocked Japanese high command. 20 aircraft destroyed, 0 American losses. The kill ratio was absolutely devastating. For 6 weeks, the 22nd and 85th Sentais had carefully preserved their strength, hoarding fighters and experienced pilots for the final defense of the home islands. They had sacrificed training time and combat experience to maintain numerical strength for the invasion everyone expected. Operation Ketsugo, the plan to defend Japan against American invasion, called for 10,000 aircraft, including trainers and obsolete fighters, to be thrown against landing forces in mass kamikaze attacks. Every Ki-84 saved was another weapon for that final battle. August 13th had just cost them 20 irreplaceable aircraft and pilots in a single engagement. Japanese commanders reviewing the combat reports struggled to understand what had happened. American fighters were supposed to be inferior to the Ki-84 in turning performance. The Frank could outclimb most American aircraft. Japanese pilots were trained in aggressive tactics that had worked throughout the Pacific War. Yet over Korea, those advantages had meant nothing. The Americans had destroyed everything they caught. The answer lay in tactics and firepower the Japanese doctrine had not prepared for. The P-47 Thunderbolt did not fight like a Zero or an Oscar. It did not engage in turning dogfights where maneuverability determined outcomes. American pilots, using boom and zoom tactics, struck from altitude advantage, used superior diving speed to build energy, fired from 800 yards with devastating accuracy, then extended away before Japanese fighters could respond. 8 50-caliber machine guns firing 200 rounds per second could destroy any aircraft ever built if they found their target. Japanese fighters optimized for dogfighting discovered too late that dogfights never developed when American pilots refused to fight that way. Imperial Japanese Army Air Service Headquarters issued immediate tactical updates. Avoid combat with P-47s whenever possible. If engagement is unavoidable, attack only with numerical superiority. Never allow Americans to dictate engagement terms. The updates acknowledged what Japanese pilots had learned over Korea at terrible cost. The aerial warfare paradigm had shifted, and Japan's remaining fighter force was on the wrong side of that shift. But the Americans faced their own crisis. The 57th Fighter Group had pushed the P-47N to its absolute operational limits on August 13th. 8 hours and 18 minutes of flight time, 1,500 miles round trip, with the final 400 miles flown, after intensive combat that tripled normal fuel consumption. Multiple aircraft returned to Ieshima with fuel gauges showing practically empty tanks. The mission had been successful beyond all expectations, but it had also been dangerous beyond all acceptable risk parameters. Group commanders reviewing the mission logs calculated that extending range by another 50 miles would have resulted in multiple aircraft ditching in the East China Sea. Dead pilots, lost aircraft, the kind of losses that no kill ratio could justify. Engineering officers identified the fundamental problem. The P-47N carried enough fuel for the mission profile, but only under ideal conditions. Combat maneuvering burned fuel at 3 times cruise rate. Damaged aircraft with rough-running engines consumed even more. Any deviation from the planned route, due to weather or navigation errors, meant insufficient fuel for the return flight. The 57th had gotten lucky on August 13th. Weather had been clear. Navigation had been perfect. All aircraft that survived combat had made it home. But luck was not strategy. The solution required aggressive fuel management that bordered on reckless. External tanks were essential. Pilots had to calculate fuel consumption to the gallon. Any combat engagement had to be brutal and brief. Get in, kill targets, get out. No extended dogfights, no chasing damaged enemies, no heroic but fuel-expensive maneuvers. Oscar Perdomo's 5 kills in 6 minutes represented the ideal engagement profile. Overwhelming firepower applied with surgical precision, minimal fuel expenditure, maximum results. That model became doctrine for long-range fighter missions in the final weeks of the Pacific War. Strike hard, strike fast, go home. August 14, 1945, changed everything again. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. Oscar Perdomo would never fly another combat mission. His 5 confirmed kills on August 13th would stand forever as the final ace-in-a-day achievement in American military history. But the impact of that morning over Korea resonated far beyond one pilot's accomplishment. The 57th Fighter Group's 20-0 kill ratio demonstrated that American air superiority had reached absolute dominance. Japanese fighters could not compete. Japanese pilots could not survive. The planned invasion of Japan would have faced minimal aerial opposition because Japan had already lost the air war completely. Intelligence analysts reviewing post-war Japanese documents discovered the true extent of damage inflicted on August 13th. The 22nd and 85th Sentais never fully recovered from that single engagement. Both units were effectively destroyed as combat-capable formations. Replacement aircraft never arrived. Replacement pilots never completed training. When Japan surrendered on August 15th, those 2 units existed only on paper. Their combat strength eliminated in the skies over Korea 48 hours earlier. The Distinguished Service Cross citation for Oscar Perdomo read like poetry written by bureaucrats attempting to describe violence. Extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. The second highest valor award the United States Army could bestow. The words captured nothing of what had actually happened. Nothing of the mathematics that kept a pilot alive over hostile territory. Nothing of the split-second decisions that separated survival from death. Nothing of charging an armed enemy with empty guns because running meant abandoning squadron mates. The paperwork accumulated in military archives, official recognition of 6 minutes that changed one man's life forever. But the real impact of August 13th went far beyond medals and citations. The engagement demonstrated conclusively that American fighter doctrine had evolved beyond anything Japan could counter. Boom and zoom tactics, energy fighting, overwhelming firepower. Those principles that seemed so simple in training had just destroyed 20 Japanese aircraft without a single American loss. That lesson would influence fighter tactics for decades. The story of Oscar Perdomo became legend in the 57th Fighter Group. The pilot who achieved ace status in a single day. The man who charged an enemy fighter with empty guns. The last American to earn that distinction in any war. Crew chiefs painted the meat chopper's nose art with extra care. Pilots requested assignments to his flight, hoping some of that luck might transfer. But Oscar Perdomo himself remained quiet about his accomplishment. 5 kills represented 5 Japanese pilots who never went home. 5 families who received death notifications. 5 young men who died in the final hours of a war that was already over. Perdomo understood that victory and tragedy existed in the same sky over Korea. And this is where the story takes its final turn. Oscar Perdomo survived 2 wars. He flew jets in Korea. He saved lives in a dead stick landing. He retired as a major after 20 years of service. He should have lived to old age telling stories at veterans gatherings. But life had one more mission waiting. One that no amount of training could prepare him for. One that would ultimately destroy the man who had charged Japanese fighters with empty guns. The final chapter of Oscar Perdomo's story is one that few people know, and it explains why heroes sometimes cannot survive peace. From 0 kills to ace in 6 minutes. From an unarmed Thunderbolt charging an armed enemy to the last pilot in American history to achieve 5 victories in a single day. Oscar Perdomo had accomplished something that fewer than 100 pilots managed during the entire war. His gun camera footage proved every claim. His Distinguished Service Cross citation documented extraordinary heroism. His name entered the record books alongside legends like Chuck Yeager and Pappy Boyington. But this is where the story takes its final turn. The twist that nobody expects. Because sometimes the pilots who survive combat cannot survive what comes after. And Oscar Perdomo's greatest battle was not fought in the skies over Korea on August 13, 1945. It was fought in the decades that followed, against enemies that no amount of training could prepare him to face. The war ended 2 days after Oscar Perdomo became an ace. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement on August 14th meant the invasion of Japan would never happen. Operation Downfall, which military planners had grimly predicted would cost 1 million Allied casualties, was cancelled. The atomic bombs and Japan's decision to surrender had saved countless lives on both sides. Oscar Perdomo returned to Los Angeles in early 1946 as one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater. He reunited with his wife and his son Kenneth, who was now old enough to recognize the father he had barely known during the war years. The baby, whose face had decorated the nose of Lil May's meat chopper, was growing into a boy who wanted to hear stories about the airplane named after him. Life seemed to offer everything a returning veteran could want. A family who loved him. A nation grateful for his service. Skills and experience that could translate into a civilian career. But Oscar Perdomo could not let go of flying. The peacetime Air Force offered him a slot. He accepted. He remained on active duty while other wartime pilots returned to civilian jobs and tried to forget the things they had seen. He flew different aircraft now, as technology advanced beyond recognition. Jets replaced propeller-driven fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt that had carried him through combat became obsolete almost overnight. Then North Korea invaded South Korea in June 1950, and war returned to the same peninsula where Oscar Perdomo had earned his place in history 5 years earlier. He was recalled to active duty and flew F-84 Thunderjets and F-86 Sabres during the Korean War. No nose art this time. No pictures of babies with cigars and derby hats. Kenneth was a teenager, too old for that kind of tribute. But Perdomo's skills remained sharp. In February 1955, those skills saved lives one final time, when his T-33 trainer developed a catastrophic fuel leak during a training flight. Gasoline fumes filled the cockpit, burning his eyes, making it nearly impossible to see the instruments or control the aircraft properly. Most pilots would have ordered their student to eject and then followed them out of the dying aircraft. Standard procedure when an aircraft became unflyable. But Oscar Perdomo stayed with the plane. He executed a dead-stick landing without engine power, bringing both himself and his student safely to the ground, while fuel vapor filled the cockpit and threatened to ignite at any moment. That landing earned him another medal and proved that the instincts forged over Korea in 1945 had never left him. He retired from the Air Force in January 1958 with the rank of major after 20 years of service. 2 wars, 5 confirmed kills in a single day, multiple decorations for valor, a career that most pilots could only dream about. Oscar Perdomo settled into civilian life in Los Angeles with his family. He had survived everything the Japanese could throw at him and everything the North Koreans could throw at him. He should have lived to old age telling war stories at veterans' reunions. But life had one more mission waiting. The legacy of August 13, 1945, extended far beyond one pilot's achievement. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved that long-range fighter escort was not only possible, but devastatingly effective. Republic Aviation's decision to redesign the Thunderbolt specifically for Pacific operations had created an aircraft that could fly 1,500-mile missions and still dominate any enemy fighter it encountered. The wet wings, carrying 93 gallons per side, the 2,800 horsepower engine, the 8 50 caliber machine guns. Every design choice had been validated in combat. The 57th Fighter Group's 20-0 kill ratio on August 13th demonstrated the superiority so completely that Japanese commanders had no response, except to acknowledge their fighter force could not compete. That lesson influenced fighter design for decades. Range mattered. Firepower mattered. The ability to dictate engagement terms mattered more than turning performance or climb rate. American boom and zoom tactics became the standard approach to air combat because they worked. Dive on the enemy with speed advantage.
Fire from 800 yards with overwhelming firepower. Extend away before the enemy can react. Repeat until the enemy stops flying. Those principles dominated jet combat in Korea and Vietnam and remain relevant in modern air warfare. The ace-in-a-day achievement stood alone in American military history. No pilot since Oscar Perdomo has shot down 5 aircraft in a single day and had those kills confirmed with the certainty that gun camera footage provided. Modern air warfare, with beyond visual range missiles and networked targeting systems, has changed the nature of aerial combat so fundamentally that achieving ace status in any single day may be impossible now. Oscar Perdomo's record has survived nearly 80 years. It will likely survive forever. But the real lesson of August 13, 1945, was never about tactics or technology or kill ratios. It was about decisiveness under pressure, about the split-second choices that separate survival from death, about the willingness to charge an armed enemy with empty guns, because running meant abandoning squadron mates who needed help. Those qualities cannot be trained. They exist in certain individuals, or they do not. Oscar Perdomo possessed them in abundance. He proved it when he turned into the 4 Ki-84 fighters diving on him from altitude advantage. He proved it when he chased a damaged enemy aircraft with 0 ammunition remaining. He proved it when he stayed with a fuel-leaking trainer and brought his student home alive. That kind of courage defines what military service means at its highest level. And Oscar Perdomo exemplified it every time he strapped into an aircraft. The Commemorative Air Force maintains a flying P-47 Thunderbolt, painted to replicate Lil May's meat chopper. The nose art shows the same baby with the same cigar and derby hat. The aircraft appears at air shows across America, introducing new generations to the story of the last ace in a day. His name appears on the memorial wall at the United States Air Force Memorial in Washington. His Distinguished Service Cross citation remains part of the official record. Oscar Perdomo's place in history seemed secure. But there was one chapter left, one final tragedy that few people know about. On May 5, 1970, a UH-1 Huey helicopter crashed and exploded 5 miles southwest of Phu Bai in South Vietnam. The aircraft carried 3 crew members. All 3 were killed. One of them was Specialist 4th Class Chris Mitchell Perdomo, the same baby whose infant face had decorated the nose of Lil May's meat chopper. The boy Oscar Perdomo had named his aircraft after 25 years earlier. Kenneth had grown up, enlisted in the Army, and volunteered as a door gunner. He had gone to war, just as his father had done. And he had died in the same kind of chaos and violence that Oscar Perdomo had survived twice. The loss destroyed Oscar Perdomo completely. He had survived Japanese fighters over Korea. He had survived North Korean MiGs.
He had survived fuel leaks and dead stick landings and 2 wars that killed millions. But he could not survive the death of his son. The man who had charged armed enemies with an empty aircraft began drinking. The alcohol consumed him the way flames had consumed those Japanese fighters he shot down. Major Oscar Francis Perdomo died on March 2, 1976 in Los Angeles. He was 56 years old. His family honored his wishes and scattered his ashes over the Pacific Ocean, the same waters he had crossed so many times during both wars. The last ace in a day returned to the sky one final time. From the son of a Mexican immigrant who worked at a milk crate company, to the last pilot in United States history to shoot down 5 aircraft in a single day, Oscar Perdomo proved that heroism does not require a prestigious background or a famous name. It requires courage in the moment that matters.
Decisiveness when every second counts. The willingness to risk everything for the mission and for the men who depend on you. Because of his actions on August 13, 1945, American pilots proved air superiority so completely that Japan's remaining fighter force became irrelevant to the war's outcome. Because of his courage, his squadron mates went home alive. Because of his legacy, we remember that the greatest achievements often come from the most unexpected sources. That is the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when history demands it. Oscar Perdomo charged Japanese fighters with empty guns, and in doing so, he secured his place among the greatest fighter pilots America has ever produced.